Contextualising Chrestomathia. So over to you, Andrew.
Right, okay. Right, just to start with, this is the title page of Chrestomathia, which appears in 1815, but Bentham continues to add to it, and one of the distinguishing features of this book is it's called a collection of papers, and we'll actually look at various aspects of this later on. But the initial impetus for Bentham being interested in education begins in 1811, so I'm going to explain something about what was going on before he got involved in actually writing Chrestomathia. And it involves his close relationship with Mill and with Francis Place. I'm sure you're all aware of the relationship with Mill. Basically, for 6 months of every year, Mill and his family used to go and stay with Bentham. First of all, a place called Barrow Green House in Oxted in Surrey, and then later on, more famously, in Ford Abbey. And I think you have to consider what's going on between these two people. Often when we're doing research, we're looking at what was actually written, or in the case of people you're teaching you, what was written fairly illegibly sometimes. But also, we have to speculate about what actually are they discussing, and sometimes their discussions sort of become manifest later on in print. Okay. Place was introduced to Bentham by James Mill by the beginning of 1812, and they remained close until Bentham's death. He had met Mill through their mutual interest in the educational initiative of the Quaker Joseph Lancaster, who independently of the Anglican Andrew Bell promoted the use of the monitorial system as a means of providing elementary education cheaply to what were termed the lower orders, i.e. the mass of the population. Place had subscribed to Joseph Lancaster's pioneering monitorial school in Borough Road as early as 1804, and later placed his son Frank in Lancaster's boarding school in Tooting. But through this experience, he realised that Lancaster had become corrupt. Place played a key role in ousting Lancaster from what became the British and Foreign School Society, exposing him as a paedophile, and was ousted himself after Lancaster exposed him as an atheist. Not surprisingly, Place became as keen as Bentham on issues of school management. The monitorial system was based on the use of older children to instruct youngsters under the general supervision of a trained teacher, following prescribed text. The Lancasterian movement was thoroughly chronicled by Place, together with his reflection on his work with Bentham on the Chrestomathia school project. So in the British Library, just around the corner, there's a very interesting volume with all his what he wrote and what he collected from this period right up to the formation of the London University, which became UCL. Not that Place himself had any real direct dealings with that. So he is, if you like, a historian, or would-be historian, of this educational movement. Bentham had retained a critical interest in the role of education since his own experiences as Westminster School and Queen's College, Oxford, which provided a classical and literary education appropriate for the lifestyle of a politician, a barrister, or simply a member of the leisured class. There's an early record of him being interested in the education of his younger brother, which shows that he was thinking about these things much earlier. But, of course, Chrestomathia is his first major work on education. In his study of pauperism in 1797, he considered an appropriate education for the poorest in society. But by 1811, he was much more focused on the way in which the educational system was manipulated by the elite, either through the mismanagement of charity or through the indoctrination of the young to protect their sinister interests. The stimulus for Bentham's closer interest in education was the formation of the National Society for the Education of the Poor in the Principles of the Church of England, which was launched with the full weight of the Archbishop of Canterbury behind it. The National Society grew rapidly as new schools were built and existing schools became affiliated. This became the dominant force in elementary education until the 1870 Education Act. In 1811, it was an immediate challenge to the non-denominational Royal Lancasterian Society, which had been in existence since 1808, and was reconstituted as the British and Foreign School Society in 1814. Joseph Lancaster had originally gained the personal approval of George III himself and the active support of the Dukes of Sussex and Kent, despite the leading role played by Quakers in its management of the society, notably William Allen. Now as a regency, there was no guarantee that royal patronage would continue to support the cause of non-sectarian education. In terms of published material, it would appear that, compared with Mill, Bentham was slow to respond to the resurgence of Anglicanism, implicit in the launch of the National Society. But in fact, he quickly began drafting an early version of Church of Englandism in 1812, before James Mill produced his challenge in a published manifesto, Schools for All, Not for Churchmen Only, which first appeared in William Allen's new journal, The Philanthropist, in 1813. And William Allen and James Mill continue to work together, so despite his being a Quaker, they get on very well. By this time, Mill and Bentham were in such frequent contact, they must have discussed Mill's writings, while Mill, in turn, probably sought Bentham's approval. They both saw the National Society as, quote, exclusionary, as their schools only provided education for Anglicans, and so promoted the sinister interests of the establishment. In the published version of Church of Englandism and its Catechism Examined, Bentham referred directly to his own experience as an undergraduate when he saw the exclusionary interest of the established church in action. He recounted the story of poor Methodist students being expelled from Oxford University, what amounted to heresy, comparing this action to the Papal Inquisition. Bentham even saw his publication as, quote, an act of expiation for his hypocrisy in declaring support for the 39 Articles of Faith, just in order to graduate. And perhaps you could be aware that in the 18th century, probably the best education was in dissenting academies, people like Joseph Priestley and so on. Considering that Place resigned from the Lancasterian British and Foreign School Society, and that the Chrestomathic school project ended in an acrimonious exchange of nearly 30 letters between Bentham and Place in 1820, it is significant he took so much care to conserve documentary evidence and later constructed his own narrative, leaving clear instructions for whoever might eventually use his material for a publication. While he was clearly concerned with establishing and maintaining his own posthumous reputation, not least as secretary of the managers of the Chrestomathic School for 5 years, his own activities show how he remained deeply committed to the utilitarian ideology expressed in Bentham and Mill's writings on education. His archive also provides evidence of a transition in Place's status, which is borne out in his correspondence with Bentham. Place was initially very deferential towards Bentham and genuinely awestruck that he should be noticed by such an eminent philosopher. In 1814, Place felt honoured to receive a set of Panopticon papers and then the first draft of Chrestomathia with a request for his comments, and flattered that Bentham should ask for his opinion. However, after working alongside Chrestomathic school managers like James Bevan, the architect, and the economist David Ricardo, who probably did more than anybody else to try and get the scheme off the ground in terms of finance, by 1820 he had become intellectually self-confident and was even prepared to argue heatedly with Bentham. On the other hand, as Bentham lacked any real sense of snobbery, he can take some credit for this transformation. It also shows how one Benthamite became nurtured within a sense of group identity, not just through his relationships with Mill and Bentham, but with others in Bentham's inner circle. David Ricardo encouraged Place in his aspirations to become a political economist and recommended Place's only book to John Murray, the publisher. If we accept Philip's view, I'm sure we will, that Bentham's concept of sinister interest had taken hold by 1804, and the view of most Bentham scholars, Bentham's development as a political radical began to take shape in 1808-9, then his association with Mill and Place in the ensuing years deserves closer attention. Each of them had skills which were useful for Bentham, and they were both workaholics, just like Bentham. As Mill demonstrated in his polemical manifesto, Schools for All, Not for Churchmen Only, and in other articles published in the Edinburgh Review, The Philanthropist, and in the supplement to Encyclopaedia Britannica, he was able to sustain relationships with publishers and express ideas more accessibly than Bentham himself. And although Bentham famously pointed out to Place how Mill's articles at Edinburgh Review had suffered at the hands of Geoffrey, the editor. Although of similar humble birth as Mill, Place had left school at 13, but by the time he started working with Bentham on the Chrestomathia school project, he had built up a successful business and enabled him to retire in his mid-40s. He was clearly reputed as a man of business, often providing an important line of communication with Bentham and Mill. While Bentham and Mill were away from London, we came close to Bentham, who clearly respected him for his love of learning, his democratic credentials as a leading veteran of the London Corresponding Society, his influence with the Radicals, and his firm opposition to priestcraft. Back in 1796, he had prepared an edition of Paine's Age of Reason for publication, and the printer went to prison. Place kept in contact with comrades from the LCS after its collapse, some of whom played an important role with him, both in the Lancasterian education movement and the Westminster Committee that organised canvassing and fundraising in Westminster's unusually wide constituency of some 11,000 voters. There was no evidence that Bentham had shown any interest in the groundbreaking election of 1807, when Westminster returned to Francis Burdett as its first radical MP, independent of the Whigs. And occasionally, Place's status as a political operator was already marked by the appearance of a Gilray cartoon. So what I'm saying here is that as early as 1807, Place was already well known as a radical. And there you can see him down there with his tailor's scissors. But actually, this was reduced before the election was won by Burdett. Okay. However, Bentham came to work closely with Burdett and drafted a bill for universal suffrage, which Burdett introduced in Parliament in 1818. It got no votes, because Burdett and Cochrane, the two MPs for Westminster, were the tellers for that, and some radical Whigs wouldn't accept the full programme. Right, by this time, Place's encouragement of the uncompromising assault on the Church of England in Chrestomathia and Church of Englandism, together with the plan for parliamentary reform, perhaps stimulated Bentham's unusual intervention in the election campaign himself, siding with Place's preferred candidate over his old friend Romilly, denouncing him as a Whig. Bentham liked to cultivate an image of himself being a hermit, but his interaction with other thinkers as well as political activists shows that this was misleading. For a prolific writer, it was sometimes a ruse to avoid being disturbed, but Bentham thrived on intellectual interaction. He had developed his sceptical ideas in the Bowood Circle, where he met Dumont and Romilly, as well as with his brother Samuel, who stimulated his interest in the Panopticon. From 1809, he began inviting James Mill and his family to his rural retreats at Barrow Green House and Ford Abbey, often for 6 months of the year. By the way, Barrow Green House has more recently been occupied by another believer in sinister interests, Muhammad Al-Fayed, whose son Dodi is buried in the garden. In 1817, he entertained the Romilly family, as well as Francis Place and his daughter Annie. Catherine Fuller's article gives a clear picture of Bentham's working practices at Ford Abbey, where most of Chrestomathia had been written. Bentham's surviving correspondence also suggests that Bentham was not simply concerned with disseminating his own ideas and extend his influence, but was keen to maintain contact with people with a wide variety of opinions and to make new contacts. I mean, for example, he even sent a copy of Chrestomathia to Lord Sidmouth, the Home Secretary, who was obviously not going to be interested. But Bentham was quite Catholic in his attitude, in the sense of he kept contact with political radicals of all colours, rather than being, if you like, a sectarian in political terms. And it reflects in a way his pragmatic view that although he had definite aims about what he wanted to achieve, he was prepared to compromise along the way. Bentham became increasingly reliant on others to edit and publish his work, and I would argue that the Chrestomathic School project contributed to the formation of a group which identified themselves as Benthamites, even though Bentham objected to the term. Such phrases as the cause and one of us, or simply the pronoun we, begin to appear in correspondence to indicate a sense of solidarity. Of course, there were frequent arguments, and the role of Bowring exemplifies that this was not simply a group of disciples, that Bentham's developing political and religious radicalism should be seen as part of a collective response, not just to the repressive nature of government policy in the years of 1815, but to the sinister interest implicit in the political system. This period was an extraordinarily productive one for Bentham, and his work on Chrestomathia could be seen as a factor in delaying the final version of Church of Englandism, in which his view of the sinister interest of the Church was focused specifically on the national society, before he broadens his argument for the case for disestablishment, expressed in classic Bentham fashion as, quote, the euthanasia of the Church. This book stands alongside Plan of Parliamentary Reform as a statement of his radical critique of the interrelated sinister interest at work in church and state. Aware of the recent fate of John and Leigh Hunt, who he had visited in prison after their paper that Examiner attacked the Prince Regent, he was restrained by fears of legal action. He did publish an extract from Church of Englandism on blasphemy in the Examiner after Joseph Hone was acquitted. So in this era, you couldn't be quite sure how much the legal system was going to penalise people. And of course there's the whole issue of jury packing, which he dealt with as well. But bearing in mind that habeas corpus was suspended in 1817, this was quite a tough time for radicals. However, Romilly abandoned the onerous task of identifying in the text possible grounds for prosecution. After Joseph Hone was acquitted on the charge of blasphemous libel, Bentham ignored Romilly's advice, who said he would definitely be prosecuted, but took the proportion, including his correspondence with William Smith MP in the text of Church of Englandism, referring to the government's tolerant response to a successful campaign to put Unitarianism on a legal footing. It is ironic that another Unitarian, John Bowring, who Bentham had entrusted with the task of publishing his work posthumously, suppressed Church of Englandism alongside Bentham's more overtly challenging works, such as Not Paul but Jesus. Right, I'm now moving on to look more closely at Chrestomathia. Chrestomathia presents several problems for the modern reader. These relate to the unwieldy structure of the book as a whole and its relationship with contemporary controversies, as well as aspects of Bentham's prolific output at a time when his ideology was still developing in his mid-60s. At both a theoretical and practical level, Bentham was responding to contemporary controversies, not just in education, but in terms of the political and legal framework which Bentham hoped to eventually shatter. We also need to consider the concept of the school in its local, national and international context. From Bentham's mind, he was proposing to conduct an experiment which, if successful, would lead to a national network of similar schools across the country. So we see him writing to American politicians, very excitably saying he's going to make this experiment and also asking for suitable people that he should send his book to. And I haven't seen the figures for this, but he gives so many copies of Chrestomathia away to people to try and influence their ideas. You wonder whether that outnumbered dramatically the number he actually sold. And it's part of Bentham's general practice that it's almost like photocopying. He gets things printed before they're published, sends them around to his mates for them to look at. It's a very collective sort of way of going about publication. Then when he does publish, he wants to target certain people he thinks may be interested, whether they're in America or Portugal or France or wherever, as well as in the UK. So he's also keen to export his educational ideas to other areas of the world, especially as the opportunities arose to influence the new elites in the new regimes in post-revolutionary Europe and South America. I haven't got time for this one. Okay. Bentham has been often associated pejoratively with the popular view that mass education as it developed in Victorian society was, quote, utilitarian. As we analyse his blueprint for the Chrestomathic school and the arguments which surrounded the implementation of his ideas, it becomes clear that this judgment is superficial and that although some utilitarian principles were embedded in the educational system, it did not develop in a way that would have met with Bentham's approval. There are two objections to this approach. First, the monitorial system, which Bentham even-handedly calls the new instruction system, was not the preserve of utilitarians. In fact, despite a rivalry between the two main proponents of the system, there was a consensus at the time that the monitorial system was the most cost-effective means of achieving mass literacy and numeracy. Much more important was the rivalry between the Church of England and nonconformists. Although Bentham's closest associates in the Chrestomathic project had been involved in the Lancasterian non-sectarian movement, Bentham made more references to Bell, partly to distance himself from the tiresome controversy about who invented the system, and partly because he had just read one of Bell's publications. In fact, in Bentham's version of what's called Chrestomathic Proposals, which was one of the items in Chrestomathia, he doesn't mention Lancaster at all, he just cites Bell. A second and more fundamental reason for rejecting the label utilitarian to describe the Victorian elementary system is that Bentham insisted on a rational and secular form of education, not the faith-based culture which became the raison d'etre of English schools, whether they were non-denominational or affiliated to the Church of England. Further, I'd argue the book was not conceived as a policy statement with regard to the merits and scales of mass education. Bentham did not disagree with the arguments put forward by Mill on this topic, but initially his Chrestomathic school project had limited objectives. Just to remind you what Mill said. Yeah, this is in the thing that you hopefully looked at. It's clear he's saying you can't just educate people according to their social status at birth. It's about human potential. Okay? Now, of course, Chrestomathia is not about teaching the poor. It's about teaching what he calls the middling class, and I'll come on to that a bit more. And it's clearly he hoped that the people he taught in that Chrestomathic school would go on to have an influence on their social inferiors. But so I don't think Bentham disagreed with that at all. And it relates to the sort of theories we have, going right back to John Locke, this sort of tabula rasa idea that children are born, their intelligence isn't fixed at birth, and through Helvetius and Condorcet and so on. But Mill, of course, took that to extremes when he educated his son, and that's another reason why utilitarianism got a bad name in education. There was clearly a shift in attitude amongst Benthamites by the time Southwood Smith was editing Chrestomathia in the 1840s. Drawing on his concept of sinister interests as well as on practical considerations, Bentham had no more confidence in the prospect of a state-controlled education system than he did in one controlled by the Church of England. It would mark the same abuse of power. The state itself was unreformed. In a government envisaging constitutional code, a Minister of Education will be operating within a secular state. When the parliamentary careers of several Benthamites were launched after the 1832 Reform Act, and the civil service attracted Benthamites like Evan Chadwick and G.R. Porter, there was more potential for influencing the education system. However, the balance of probabilities was that the interest of the established church would remain paramount. So, what are the problems in reading this book? First of all, if I go back to this, its structure is not coherent. This probably reflects two factors. First, Bentham's intentions clearly change in the course of assembling what he calls a collection of papers, first drafted in 1814 and finally completed in 1817. Secondly, he was targeting two audiences. He wanted to attract wealthy investors who would be expected to buy £10 shares in the project. or wanted to emulate his ideas in other countries. However, unusually for Bentham, the book contains elements which initially aimed at the general reader, including in an appendix a relatively brief prospectus for a Chrestomathic proposal. This, curiously, was not the same as a proposal originally circulated with his permission, well, he writes about this rather grudgingly later, by Mill and Placed to generate subscriptions before the book itself was published. Their version was reissued twice in 1816 and 1817, with a long list of who had already described, headed by David Ricardo, 200 quid, but also showing that only half the money had been raised that they needed for the school. In Bentham's mind, the Chrestomatic tables, there's no room on the screen as you might think for this, were also designed to encapsulate his key ideas in easily digestible easily digestible form for a general audience. One might call it an idiot's guide or utilitarian education for dummies. He tried to avoid any difficulty by writing this. The hard words, viz., those derived from Greek or Latin, are throughout explained. Through necessity alone are they here employed. Under almost every one of these names we found included objects already familiar in every family, even to children who've just learnt to read. You may have noticed one careless mistake here. For those of you who lack the classical education, then essential for any university student, he does not explain the Latin abbreviation viz. This is not just the name of a still extant scurrilous magazine, it is short for vide licet. Look it up. These tables are clearly laid out and cross-referenced in relation to a more detailed exposition of their meaning in the ensuing pages. The first table is mainly concerned with four issues: the advantages of learning in general, the objections people might make to his proposal, the reasons for including or omitting areas of the curriculum, and the logical stages through which children learn. The second table deals with the pedagogy of what he calls the new instruction system, i.e. the Monitora system, and the principles of school management. Bentham's ideas about the advantages of learning were consistent with his long-held view that the objective of education was, not surprisingly, the greatest happiness of the greatest number. When initially presenting his ideas to a wider audience, which might include both patrician and clerical investors, he was sufficiently pragmatic to choose his words carefully and to identify issues which had a broad appeal. Utilitarians and moralists were both united in the view that education could benefit both the individual and society by reducing the attraction of crime and disorder and developing useful skills. And this issue of crime and disorder is paramount at this time. In 1816, there's a select committee which is chaired by Brougham, for which Francis Place is one of the many witnesses. And the main obsession about the lower orders was fear. It was they need to be taught basic reading and writing and so on, but they really need to know their place. They need to have moral education. There's a fear of crime, a fear of disorder. In my view, the reference to the middling and higher ranks in life was deliberately misleading. Place himself obviously thought that Joseph Hume was wasting his time trying to solicit funds from aristocrats. The higher ranks had access to boarding schools which prepared students for Oxford and Cambridge, and at the time Westminster School was attracting record numbers of students, reaching a maximum of 300 pupils by 1818. And in recent years it's also been well known as a place for politicians to get their education. Think of Tony Benn, thinking of, I've forgotten his name, the last Liberal Democrat Deputy Prime Minister. Yeah. When he was approached as a potential investor, Lord Lansdowne even saw the Chrestomathic school as a potential threat to the major public schools, arguing that he would prefer them to be reformed. However, the inclusion of higher ranks on the title page could have had two other purposes, not only to attract investors, but to provide the new school with prestige. And one of his inducements was to suggest that the first crop of graduates from this school would be particularly advantaged. Accordingly, at this stage, we're extolling the virtues of respectability rather than openly anticipating a democratic future. In a very accessible way, he identified 5 advantages of learning based on the principles of utility. Ignorance could obviously lead to what he called mischievousness, a view compatible with a moralistic approach, though he avoids terms such as sin, which were more loaded, fictitious entities. These 5 advantages pupils would gain through learning were, first, a proportional share of general respect. Perhaps we could redefine this as self-respect. Secondly, the avoidance of boredom. He uses the word ennui. As I'm about the same age as Bentham when he wrote this, I find this particularly relevant. He refers to the malady of not knowing what to do with oneself, to which men of business are particularly prone in retirement. Of course, Bentham himself was fully occupied while writing right up to his death in his mid-80s, and his sense of mortality was a spur to make full use of the time he had left, and even to make full educational use of his remains. Place retired from his tailoring business in 1816 only to spend more time actively promoting what he saw as the interests of the working class, as well as diversifying his business interests, and dedicating his evenings to study, keeping a daily record of his readings and note-taking. Did that for 5 years. The third and fourth advantage are security, as you might expect. But here we have security against inordinate sensuality. Nothing to do. It's Freudian slip, and idleness. Here he is obviously weighing up the pain and pleasure involved. As a sentiment, this would accord perfectly with moralists. Place often contrasted the drunkenness of the ignorant with the sobriety of the educated, but usually alongside the evidence that the lifestyle of the lower orders, unlike the aristocracy, was improving. He talks about the fact that aristocrats get drunk in private, and it's the lower orders who are seen in the street, pissed out their heads, and it's not fair. I hope the fifth point is the one you all can relate to. Learning provides social benefits in terms of security, quote, for admission into good company, from which you can derive, quote, present and harmless pleasure, or, quote, future profit or security. Of course, this could be interpreted in terms of the role of education in promoting networking skills. These non-contentious advantages are then explored in more detail with suggestions that the breadth and depth of the curriculum would enable pupils to have a better chance of discovering their aptitude for a particular role. However, what is contentious in this section of the table is an omission, the lack of any moral or religious sentiment. While the declaration there is no need for corporal punishment certainly smacks of secularism. Bentham did identify some potential conservative objections to his plan. I like this idea. He sort of he thinks in ahead of what possible objections are going to be and puts it out there. First of all, that it cannot be implemented in practice. And certainly Place and Mill thought he was putting too much into his curriculum. Secondly, that it showed, quote, disregard to classical learning and other polite accomplishments. And most telling of all, Bentham foresaw that such critics were concerned that a consequence of educating even the middling classes could be, quote, uppishness. It sounds a bit like attitude in America towards, quote, uppity niggers. Keep them in their place. Here, Bentham counters the fear frequently expressed by those who prioritise the moral education, the lower orders, alongside basic numeracy literacy. From such a viewpoint, there is a danger that pupils could be overeducated and become dissatisfied with their ascribed role in society. It's probably a bit like that in Greece now. In this context, despite declaring that his school aimed to cater for, quote, the middling and higher ranks of life, Bentham is showing his sympathy for social mobility and opposition to simple instrumentalism, as we saw with James Mill's views. Just to say something about what he means by middling classes is a bit confusing. I don't think he really means what he calls the upper middle class, what Marx might call the bourgeoisie, people who are actually getting the Industrial Revolution underway. He's talking about tradesmen and skilled artisans and some professionals. So it's what we might call lower middle class rather than the bourgeoisie. So, Bentham's initial plan for Chrestomathia was deliberately framed in an accessible format with a clear distinction between key principles and more detailed argument. However, by the time he completed the second part of the volume, he was engaged with a discourse of a much higher level. His fourth appendix, the essay on nomenclature and classification, was longer than the whole of the original edition of the book. While it is essential to address the issue of taxonomy for clarity in scientific and philosophical communication, Bentham's obsessive neology does seem to have been counterproductive. The editors of the 1983 edition, sticking up from here, painstakingly include in their index a large number of Bentham's neologisms, from abioscopic physiurgics to zooscopic physiurgics, which that is, mineralogy and zoology. The use of such words rather obscured the strong case to be made for scientific education. It is ironic that Bentham was attacked for excluding classics from the curriculum and preempted this criticism, but flaunted his own extensive knowledge of Greek in this context. For example, later on in Not Paul but Jesus, he's actually using a Greek New Testament. So, what explains when Francis Place was editing it, he didn't change it very much because he couldn't go back to that. In Bentham's defence, we must remember he lived in an age of great scientific advance when taxonomy was a very live issue. But unlike his friend, the academic chemist William Allen, who became a member of the Royal Society and gave lectures on experimental philosophy, Bentham was too detached from contemporary scientific and philosophical institutions for most of his terms to gain acceptance. It is a shame that Bentham hasn't been accorded the equivalent of an eponymous SI unit. Maybe a Bentham could be an ultimate indivisible unit of pleasure. The final collection of papers also includes other material which aims beyond the original scope of the work, including a sketch of the field of technology, in which he recommends that, quote, it is not to the very end of the proposed Chrestomathic course, viz., say for 7 or 8 years, that any such political course is so much as proposed to be delivered. One of Place's criticisms of his original draft, he should offer to accommodate children up to 16, and both he and Mill thought that Bentham's programme of study was unwieldy. Bizarrely, the 7th appendix provides a course on technology. You think, what was happening at that time and in the Industrial Revolution? And this was a Royal Society publication by a bishop in 1668. And he was surrounded by people who really knew what was going on. Place's friends include Alex Galloway, who had the largest steam engine factory in London and provided engines for the Greek Navy in the 1820s. They didn't work, but he did. And when preparing for Joseph Hume's Select Committee on Artisans and Machinery in 1824, Francis Place drew on his contacts with other leading engineers, people like Brahma, Maudsley, etc. Southwood Smith, preparing Chrestomathia in 1843, had to cope with the pace of intellectual development, and seeing that Bentham's 8th appendix on geometry and algebra needed revision, consulted UCL's first professor of mathematics, Augustus de Morgan, who in turn considered it should not be revised, despite the fact that some of Bentham's suggestions were obsolete, because some of his trains of thought were sufficiently useful or original to deserve republication. Or maybe Augustus Morgan couldn't be asked. In parallel with Chrestomathia, Mill's polemical manifesto, Schools for All, formed the basis of a new initiative by Place, Mill and Wakefield to create the West London Lancasterian Association. So I'm going to say something briefly about the WLLA, just to say that these things are happening simultaneously from 1813 to 1816. So Mill and Place are working to try and create this new organisation in Westminster at the same time as supporting Bentham in setting up a high-level school in his back garden. The WLLA is significant not because it's successful, it only acquired one school, but because it attempted to provide education on a more radical basis than the British Foreign School Society, the mainstream Lancasterian group. Furthermore, the period of its existence coincided with the original plans for the Chrestomathic School and preparations for the publication of Chrestomathia. Place felt he had to be careful not to damage the prospects of the WLA when making plans simultaneously with Bentham School. Writing to Edward Wakefield, close collaborator, in January 1814, about a public meeting he was planning for the WLLA, he made this clear. Nothing must be said at this meeting respecting the superior schools. It would stir up a dreadful opposition to the common ones and distract the attention of the audience, and it is, besides, unnecessary. He was trying to get, in a way, two groups of investors in to try and keep it slightly separate. It's with the WLLA you have this different attitude towards class, where rather than the National Society, the Anglican group, and the BFSS, the Nonconformist group, this was not saying we've got to educate the poor. It's saying we're going to educate the poor alongside other people. At the same time, he's seeing the middle class as leaders in this role. So this is Joseph Hume in August 1813. The real valuable principles of our constitution have arisen from and are dependent upon the middle class of society. The noble and rich would undoubtedly contribute freely, but the middle and lower classes, by dividing their labour, would put their shoulders to the wheel. And so James Mackintosh and other places, colleagues, emphasised that the middle ranks of society, quote, that respectable, enlightened and virtuous class which forms the chief beauty as well as the principal security of a state. But you look in a bit more detail and there's this objection to labelling the poor. Wakefield wanted to avoid, quote, degrading the people by draining them into charity schools, and expressed this intention succinctly in a letter to Place, where they were hoping to replicate the WLLA in Southwark. So what he wrote: I'm not aware of a better term than the South London Lancasterian, as it avoids the use of poor or lower orders, which are hateful upon principle and detrimental if our plans are to be extended to, quote, schools for all, in which ranks or castes are not to be thought of. So this makes it absolutely clear that Mill's schools for all, which becomes the slogan for the West London Lancasterian Association, has got a double meaning. It's schools for all, whatever your religion, and it's schools for all, whatever your class. Of course, the downside for this, you had to pay to go there. It wasn't a charity. Just as with Bentham School, you had to pay to go to the Chrestomathic school. But it was a day school, it was cheaper than a boarding school. While the aim was to expect parental contributions, the question of poorer families being subsidised by the unreformed state was not really addressed at this stage. Although after 1832, when they felt they had a foothold within the state apparatus, Benthamites became reconciled to the need for the state rather than charities to take a role in funding education. During the lifetime of the Chrestomathic school project, it was clear where the government's priorities lay. In 1818, the Church Buildings Act provided £1 million to provide for Anglican worship in newly urbanised areas, followed by another £500,000 in 1824. This is taxpayers' money to one sect. Robert Owen suggested in 1818 that the churches should be designed for a dual purpose, to provide education on weekdays. The response was a mirror image of Bentham's refusal to countenance his school to be let on Sundays for any purpose. The state funding the established church dwarfed the level of support for education. In 1833, the first use of taxpayers' money for that purpose was a mere £20,000. In the same year, £20 million was awarded in compensation to slave owners. And you might be aware of the legacies of British slave ownership project at UCL. It's amazing. Right. The WLLA and later the Chrestomathic School Project were both conceived in 1813, and they were both informed by the rigorous demographic and institutional surveys of Westminster organised by Wakefield and Place. Place was thus able to utilise his local knowledge as well as the organisational expertise he had developed as a leading member of the Westminster Committee since 1807. In this context, the drafting of Chrestomathia should not necessarily be seen as intending to provide a comprehensive blueprint for utilitarian education, but as complementing other utilitarian initiatives which are being developed simultaneously. Bentham himself described the proposed school as an experiment, and provision was made to underwrite any losses for 3 years if the school failed to attract sufficient pupils. Basically said, once you got 50 people subscribing, even though he envisaged 1,000, he would guarantee that the school would stay open. Now, the whole scheme collapses in 1820 and Place has to pay back all the subscribers in 1821. But does that mean it's the end of Bentham's interest in education? He later acknowledged that Matthew Davenport Hill had formulated similar ideas independently by setting up Hazelwood School. In his customary manner, Bentham invited him to dine with him to discuss their views on education. In a letter to his brother enclosing a copy of Hill's Public Education, Bentham was impressed that Hill had in effect developed his ideas more fully. Knowing nothing of Chrestomathia, to his astonishment, he finds that the Chrestomathia principles coincide throughout with the practice they had arrived at through long fumbling. But their establishment, being a boarding school, includes morals and politics, and thereby goes far beyond Chrestomathia, confining himself, as it does, to intellectuals. By 1825, Bentham was fully committed to supporting Hazelwood, and admitted to Simon Bolivar his own school would not be built, perhaps implicitly recognising that Hill's school was a more appropriate institution than the Chrestomathic day school, in which to experiment with educational theory. Well, he's dealing with about 40 children, not hundreds. Although he was disingenuous in suggesting that Hill's success was a key factor in his decision not to implement his plans for a school to be erected in the back garden. So this is what he wrote to Bolivar. I had formed a plan for conducting the intellectual part of the education of boys in a building which, for some extraordinary disappointment, I should have erected 8 or 10 years ago in that garden of mine which you saw. On looking into a work published not long ago by Mr. Hill, I saw that to principles as to the intellectual branch of education, perfectly agreeing with me, he had added others belonging to the moral branch, which were the result of genius, operating upon an experience which had never been within my reach. On inquiry, finding that theory had in that instance received the fullest confirmation from practice, I from that moment determined to give up my whole scheme altogether and to apply myself to the giving enlargement to the establishment of Mr. Hill's. I don't know if Place saw that letter, but in fact he and Bentham had this extraordinary correspondence. You know, they're living about 5 minutes walk from each other. Place lives at the top of what is now Whitehall, it's then called Charing Cross, and Bentham's back garden backed onto St James's Park. And I just imagine them sending their servants to each other with these notes, because sometimes there are 4 different letters on the same day, and they're going backwards and forwards, because Place is so furious that the whole scheme is blown up in his face, and it's not happening. But Bentham puts it another way in this. Just to show you... Oh, yes, I meant to show you that. That's actually... In 1817, that's when Place went to Ford Abbey. This is where... It wasn't just a summer residence. He was there for about... Bentham was there about 6 months of the year with Mill and his family. You know, this is a collective experience. And this was actually based on a sketch she made. Of course, she died the following year, and then her husband committed suicide. But on the day that this appeared in the Morning Chronicle, Bentham looked at this story and thought, I've got to send this to Hazelwood. It was a story about a Spanish schoolmaster who in 50 years was responsible for all these things. And of course, he wanted that school to not to have corporal punishment. And I think it's a reminder of this humane aspect to Bentham that you don't get from Gradgrind or Choke'em in Hard Times. You know, this sort of image of Victorian education as being pretty brutal. Plus, of course, the whole thing about facts being learnt for their own sake does not apply to the way in which Mill and Bentham wanted children to learn facts. The whole point of the section on nomenclature and so on was to say we've really got to sort out what children are taught and have the proper sequence of learning from simple things to more advanced things. as you put it, a utilitarian approach. Right, I think I better wind up fairly quickly. In some ways, I'm glad that Chrestomathic school was never built, as it could have been a disaster and made Bentham a laughingstock. I haven't dwelt on his idiosyncrasies which scuppered the project, but his obsession with installing an organ definitely would have led to problems. Place was complacent in suggesting that the noise of so many children in one room would enable them to develop the skill of concentrating and avoiding distractions. There were clearly architectural issues to do with lighting, acoustics, and the provision of enough playground space in which children could assemble the whole school. Bentham became very protective of his garden, and early on in the project, David Ricardo nearly bought land in Leicester Square as an alternative. Other sites were investigated in Bloomsbury, even after Place had refunded all the original investors. In contrast, Broome and Mill were much more effective in finding a site and funds for the original London University in Gower Street, which Bentham supported and which embodied some of his principles. Some of you might be familiar with that. It's a famous cartoon about the conflict between UCL, as it was originally called, University of London, and King's College. And you have money and interest, sinister of course, and bishops, King's College forever, and here we have sense and science, and I believe that's Bentham, I'm not sure.
The one with the dressing going on is Bentham.
Yeah. Oh yeah, there he is, yeah. Okay.
Broom with the broom. As he was always depicted. Isn't that James Mill falling off the back?
Right. Okay, I've had to cut out some material I've extemporised and so on. What I found out to say is ultimately the conflict between the National Society and its conformist rivals that had sparked off Bentham Mill's interventions became less acute with the repeal of the Test and Corporations Act in 1827, which removed restrictions on nonconformists, and the Catholic Emancipation Act of 1829. These, of course, were welcomed by Bentham in terms of religious liberty, but it was not until 1888 the requirement for defendants and witnesses to swear on the Bible was lifted. His vision of a secular state which valued scientific and technical education still remained unfulfilled. And just to bring it up to date, I taught in a church school for 25 years and taught sociology as well, and I find this very interesting that nearly a third of children today are taught in denominational schools at primary level, and a growing proportion at secondary level. So the education system is now more important for putting children in contact with spirituality than places of worship, because attendance, as you probably know, is down to about 8% or something like that. Okay, so I see the failure of Bentham and Mill and utilitarians in trying to establish a secular tradition. And if you compare it with America and France, that's quite an interesting, I hope, thought. Okay.
Okay, many thanks indeed.